Well, howdy, and welcome to another edition of Rail Fan Robert's Reading Railroad. Tonight, the Hardy Boys in Part 9 of The Tower Treasure. Chapter 17, An Unexpected Find. Throwing the dirt in great spadefuls, Frank uncovered the chest completely. It was about 2 feet long, 6 inches wide, and a foot deep. "The treasure!" Joe cried out, running up. Mr. Hardy was at his son's heels and looked in amazement at Frank's discovery. The boy lifted the chest out of the hole and instantly began to raise the lid on which there was no lock. Everyone held his breath. Had the Hardys really uncovered the jewels and securities stolen from the Applegates? Frank flung back the lid. The three sleuths stared at the contents. They had never been more surprised in their lives. Finally, Joe found his voice. "Nothing but a bunch of flower bulbs." The first shock of disappointment over, the detective and his sons burst into laughter. The contents of the chest were such a far cry from what they had expected that now the situation seems ridiculous. "Well, one thing is sure," said Frank. "Red Jackley never buried this chest. I wonder who did." "I can answer that," a voice behind them replied, and the Hardys turned to see Herd Applegate, clad in bathrobe and slippers, walking toward them. "Well, good morning, Mr. Applegate," the boys chorused, and their father added, "You see, we're on the job. For a couple of moments we thought we'd found your stolen property." Herd Applegate's face took on a stern look. "You didn't find my securities," he said, "but maybe you found a clue to the thief. Robinson buried that chest full of bulbs. That's what he done with Adela's jewelry and my securities. He buried them someplace, but I'll be willing to bet anything it wasn't on the grounds here." Frank, realizing the man was not in a good humor this morning, tried to steer the conversation away from the stolen valuables. "Mr. Applegate," he said, "why did Mr. Robinson bury these flower bulbs here?" The owner of Tower Mansion gave a little snort. "That man's nutty about unusual flowers. He said to Europe for these bulbs. They must have been kept in a They have to be kept in a cool, dark place for several months. So he decided to bury them. He's always doing something queer like that. Why, do you know what he tried to get me to do? Put up a greenhouse here on the property so he could raise all kinds of rare flowers." "That sounds like a swell hobby," Joe spoke up. "Swell nothing," Mr. Applegate replied. "I guess you don't know how much greenhouses cost. And besides, growing rare flowers takes a lot of time. Robinson had enough to do without fiddling around with making great big daisies out of little wild ones or turning cowslips into orchids." Frank whistled. "If Mr. Robinson can do that, he's a genius." "Genius? That's a joke," said Mr. Applegate. "Well, go on with your digging. I want this mystery cleared up." It was decided that Mr. Hardy, with his superior powers of observation, would scrutinize the ground near both towers. Whenever it looked as if the ground had been turned over recently, the boys would dig at the spot. The chest of flower bulbs was carefully replaced and the dirt shoveled over it. "Here's a place where you might dig," Mr. Hardy called presently from the opposite side of the old tower. When the boys arrived with their spades, he said, "I have an idea. A dog dug up this spot, and probably all you'll find is a beef bone, but we don't want to miss anything." This time Joe's spade hit the object which had been buried, and as his father had prophesied, it was proven to be only a boat secreted by some dog. The three Hardys transferred their work to the new tower. All this time, Herd Applegate had been looking on in silence. From the corners of their eyes, the Hardys could catch an expression of satisfaction on the elderly man's face. Mr. Hardy glanced at his wristwatch and said, "Well, boys, I guess this is our last try." He indicated another spot a few feet away. "You fellows must get cleaned up and go to school." Undaunted by their failures so far, Frank and Joe dug in with a will. In a few moments they had uncovered another small chest. "Whoa, this one is heavy," Frank said as he lifted it from the hole. "Then maybe it's the stolen property," Joe exclaimed. Even Mr. Applegate showed keen interest in this time and leaned over to raise the lid himself. The box contained several sacks. "The jewels!" Joe cried out. "And that flat shaped sack could contain the securities," Frank said enthusiastically. Mr. Applegate picked up one of the circular bags and quickly untied the string wound around the top. His face took on a look of utter disgust. "Seeds!" he fairly shouted. Mr. Hardy had already picked up the flat sack. He looked almost as disappointed as Mr. Applegate. "Flower catalogs!" he exclaimed. "They seem to be in various foreign languages." "Oh, Robinson was always sending for things from all over the world," the Tower Mansion owner remarked. "I told him to destroy 'em. Paid too much attention to that stuff when he might have been doing something useful. I suppose he buried the catalog so I wouldn't find 'em." After a long breath, the elderly man went on. "Well, we reached the end of the line. You Hardys haven't proven a thing, but you've certainly tore up my house and grounds." The three sleuths had to admit that this was true, but told him they were still fired by two hopes: to clear Mr. Robinson of the charge against him and to find the stolen property. As they put their spades back into the Hardy car, Mr. Applegate invited them into the house to wash and have a bite to eat. "I guess you boys could do with a second breakfast," he added, and the brother thought, maybe at times Mr. Applegate isn't such a bad sort. They accepted the invitation and enjoyed the meals of waffles and honey. Then their father drove them to Bayport High. Frank and Joe had no sooner stepped from the car than they heard their names called. Turning, they saw Lola Morton and Callie Shaw coming toward them. "Hey, boys!" "Hi, girls." "Say, did you hear what happened early this morning?" Callie asked. "No. School called off for today?" Joe asked eagerly. "I wish it were," Callie sobered. "It's about Mr. Robinson. He's been arrested again." "No!" The Hardy stared at Callie, thunderstruck. "Why?" Frank demanded. Lola took up the story, saying she and Chet had heard the bad news on the radio that morning. They had stopped at the Robinsons' home when their father brought them to school to find out more about what had happened. It seems that Chief Collick had an idea Mr. Robinson was in league with the thief Jackley, that man your father got the confession from, so he arrested him. Poor Mrs. Robinson, she doesn't know what to do. And Mr. Robinson had just managed to find another job," Callie said sadly. "Oh, can't you boys do something?" "We're working on the case as hard as we can," Frank replied, and told the girls about their sleuthing the evening before and early that morning. At that moment the school bell rang and the young people had to separate. Frank and Joe were deeply concerned by what they had just heard. At lunch, they met Jerry, Phil, Tony, and Chet Morton and told them the news. "This is tough on Slim," Phil remarked. Tough on the whole family, Chet declared. The boys discussed the situation from all angles and racked their brains for some way in which they could help the Robinsons. They concluded that the only actual discovery of the stolen jewels and bonds would clear Mr. Robinson of the suspicion which hung over him. That means there's only one thing to do, Frank said. We must find that loot. After school, he and Joe played baseball for the required period, then went directly home. They had no heart for further sports activities. It was a dull, gloomy day, indicative of rain, and this did not raise the boys' spirits. Frank, who was restless, finally suggested, "Let's take a walk. Maybe it will help clear the cobwebs from our brains," Joe agreed. They told their mother they would be home by supper time and then set off. The brothers walked a mile after mile, and then as they turned back, they were drawn as if by magnets to Tower Mansion. "This place is beginning to haunt me," said Joe as they walked up the driveway. Suddenly, Frank caught his brother's arm. "I just had an idea. Maybe Jack Lee in his deathbed confession was confused and meant some other robbery he committed. Besides, at some time in every mystery, the most innocent seeming people become suspect. What proof is there that the Applegates haven't pulled a hoax? For reasons of their own, they might say the things had been stolen from their safe. Don't forget, Dad didn't find any fingerprints on it except Mr. Applegate's. Frank, you have a point there. That man and his sister act so mean sometimes. I wouldn't put it past them to try and cheat the insurance company," said Joe. "Exactly," his brother agreed. "For the moment, let's play it this way. We'll pretend they're suspects and do a little spying about this place." Instantly, the boys left the roadway and disappeared among the shrubbery that lined it. Making their way cautiously, they moved forward toward Tower Mansion. The place was in darkness, with the exception of three lighted rooms on the first floor. "What's your idea, Frank?" his brother whispered. "To learn something that might tell us whether or not the Applegates are implicated in the robbery?" "Yes, maybe we'll get a clue if we keep our eyes and ears open." The boys walked forward in silence. They approached the mansion from the end where the old tower stood. Somewhere, not far from them, they suddenly heard footsteps on the gravel walk. In a flash, the brothers dodged behind a tree. The footsteps came closer and closer, and the boys waited to see who was approaching. Was it one of the Applegates or someone else? Before they could find out, the person's footsteps receded, and the boys emerged from their hiding place. Suddenly, a glaring light was beamed down directly on them. It came from the top room of the old tower. Chapter 18. A startling deduction. "Duck!" Frank ordered in a hoarse whisper, quickly dropping to the ground. Instantly, Joe threw himself face down alongside his brother. "You think the person with the flashlight in the tower saw us?" Frank asked. "He could have, but maybe not. We sure went down fast." The strong flashlight was not trained on them again. It beamed out a window of the tower in another direction, then turned off. "Well, what say?" Joe asked. "Shall we go up to the mansion and continue our sleuthing?" Frank was of the opinion that if they did, they might get into trouble. Even if they had not been recognized, the person in the tower probably had spotted them. "I'd like to find out who was in the tower," Joe would argue. "It's just possible the Applegates don't know anything about him." Frank laughed quietly. "Don't let your imagination run away with you," he advised. As the boys debated about whether to leave the grounds or to go forward, the matter was suddenly taken out of their hands. From around the corner rushed a huge police dog, growling and barking. It apparently had scented the brothers and was bounding directly toward them. Frank and Joe started to run pell mell, but were unable to keep ahead of the dog. In a few minutes, he blocked their path menacingly and set up a ferocious bark. "I guess we're caught," Frank said, "and I hope this old fellow won't take a piece out of my leg." The two boys tried to make friends with the animal, but he would not let them budge. "Well, what do we do now?" Joe asked in disgust as the dog continued to growl menacingly. "Wait to be rescued," Frank replied tersely. A moment later, they saw a bobbling light coming their direction, and presently Mr. Applegate appeared. He looked at the boys in complete astonishment. "Boy, you fellows never give up, do you?" he remarked. "What have you been doing? More digging?" The brothers did not reply at once. They were embarrassed at having been discovered, but relieved that the man did not suspect what they really intended to do. The owner of Tower Mansion took their lack of response to mean he was right. "I'm just not going to have any more of my grounds ruined," he said gruffly. "I borrowed this watchdog Rex, and he's going to keep everybody away. If you have any reason for wanting to see me, you better phone first, and I'll keep Rex chained." "Who was up in the tower with a flashlight?" Frank asked the elderly man. "My sister. She got it into her head that maybe she was smarter than you fellows and couldn't find the stolen stuff in the old tower. But she didn't." Frank and Joe suppressed grins as he went on. "And then Adela decided to flash that high powered flashlight around the grounds, thinking we might have a lot of curious visitors because of the publicity. Apparently, she picked you up." The boys laughed. "Yes, she did," Frank admitted. "Between her and Rex, I guess you needn't worry about any prowlers." Frank and Joe said good night to Herd Applegate and started down the driveway. This time the dog did not follow him. He remained at the man's side until the Hardys were out of sight. As they trudged homeward, Joe remarked, "This seems to be our day for exciting events that fizzle out like wet fireworks." "Yes, nothing to show for all our work." At supper, both Mr. and Mrs. Hardy laughed at the boys' story of their encounter with the dog. Then they became serious when Frank asked his father if he thought there was a chance the Applegates might be guilty of falsely reporting a robbery. "It's possible, of course," the detective answered, "but the Applegates are so well to do, I can't see any point in their trying such a thing. I believe it's best for us to stick to the original idea that someone really did take those jewels and securities from the safe, and that person was Jackley." As the boys were going to bed that night, Frank remarked to his brother, "Tomorrow is Saturday, and we have the whole day free. I vote we set ourselves the goal of solving the mystery before night." "A big order, but I'm with you," Joe replied with a grin. They were up early and began to discuss what course of sleuthing they should follow. "I think we ought to start off in a completely new tack," Joe suggested. "And in which direction?" Frank asked him. "In the direction of the railroad." Oh. Joe went on to explain that one thing they had not done was find out about Red Jackley's habits when he worked around Bayport. If they could talk to one or more persons who had known him, they might pick up some new clue which would lead to the stolen property. "Well, good idea, Joe," his brother agreed. "Let's take our lunch and make an all day trip on our motorcycle." Thanks. Mr. Hardy had left the house very early, so his sons did not see him. When his wife heard the boys' plan, she thought it was an excellent one and immediately offered to make some sandwiches for them. By the time they were ready to leave, she had two small boxes packed with a hearty picnic lunch. Goodbye and good luck, Mrs. Hardy called as the brothers rode off. Thanks, Mother, for everything, the young detectives chorused as they started off. When Frank and Joe reached the Bayport Railroad station, they questioned the station master and learned he had been with the company only a year and had not known Red Jack. Did he work on a passenger train? The man asked. I don't think so, Frank replied. I believe he was employed as a maintenance man. Then, said the station master, I'd advise you to go out along the highway to the railroad crossing and interview a couple of old flagmen who are still around. Both of them seem to know everybody and everything connected with the railroad for the past 50 years, he chuckled. Oh, the boys knew of two grade crossings some miles out of town and now headed for them. At the first one, they learned that the regular flagman was home ill, and his substitute had never heard of Red Jack. Frank and Joe went on. At the next crossing, they found old Mike Halley, the flagman there, busy at his job. His bright blue eyes searching their faces for a moment. Then he amazed them by saying, You're Frank and Joe Hardy, sons of the famous detective Fenton Hardy. You know us? Frank asked. I must confess, I don't recall having met you before. And you ain't, the man responded. But I make it a rule to memorize every face I see in the newspapers. Never know when there's going to be an accident and I might be called on to identify some people. The boys gulped at this gruesome thought. Then Frank asked Hallie if he remembered a railroad man named Jackley, Red Jackley. I recollect a man named Jackley, but he wasn't never called Red when I knew him. I reckon he's the same fellow, though. You mean the one I read went to jail? That's the man. He out of the pen yet? Mike Hallie questioned. He died, Joe replied. Our dad is working on a case that has some connection with Jackley, and we're trying to find out something about him. Then what you want to do, said the flagman, is go down to the Bayport and Coastline Railroad. That is where Jackley used to work. He was around the station at Cherryville. That ain't so far from here. He pointed in a northerly direction. Thanks a million, Frank said. You've helped us a lot. The boys set off on their motorcycles for Cherryville. When they came to the small town, a policeman directed them to the railroad station, which was about half a mile out of town. The station stood in a depression below a new highway and was reached by a curving road which ran parallel to the tracks for several hundred feet. The building itself was a small square, very much in need of paint. A few nearby frame buildings were in a bad state of disrepair. An old wooden water tank, about 70 yards from one side of the station house, sagged precariously. At the same distance on the other side rose another water tank. This one, painted red, was of metal and in much better condition. Frank and Joe parked their motorcycles and went into the station. A man in his shirt sleeves and wearing a green visor was bustling about behind the ticket window. Are you a station master? Frank called to him. The man came forward. I'm Jake, station master, ticket seller, baggage slinger, express handler, mail carrier, janitor, even rice thrower. You name it, I'm your man. The boys burst into laughter. Then Joe said, If there's anybody here who can tell us what we want to know, I'm sure it's you. But first, what do you mean you're a rice thrower? The station agent guffawed. Well, it don't happen often, but when a bride and groom comes down here to take a train, I just go out, grab some of the rice, and throw it along with everybody else. I reckon if it'll make them happy, they, I want to be part of the proceedings. Again, the Hardys roared with laughter, and Frank inquired if the man had known Red Jackley. I sure did, Jake replied. Funny kind of fellow. Work like mad one minute, loaf on the job the next. One thing about him, he never wanted anybody to give him any orders. Did you know that he died recently? Frank asked. No, I didn't. I'm real sorry to hear that. Jackley wasn't a bad sort when I knew him. Just got to keep in the wrong kind of company, I guess. Can you tell us any particular characteristics he had? Frank questioned. Frank. Jake scratched his head above his visor. Finally, he said, the thing I remember most about Jackley was he was a regular monkey. He was nimble as could be, racing up and down freight car ladders. At the moment, they heard a train whistle, and the man said hurriedly, Gotta leave you now, boys. Come back some other time when I ain't so busy. Gotta meet this train. The Hardys left him, and Frank suggested, Let's eat our lunch and come back. They found a little grove of trees beside the railroad tracks and propped their motorcycles against a large tree. I'm starved, said Frank, seating himself under the tree and opening his box of lunch. Boy, this is good, Joe exclaimed a moment later as he bit hungrily into a thick roast beef sandwich. If Jackley had only stayed with the railroad company, Frank observed as he munched a deviled egg, it would have been better for everyone. He sure caused a lot of trouble before he died, Joe agreed. And he's caused a lot more since, the way things have gone, for the Robinsons especially. The boys gazed reflectively down the tracks, gleaming in the sun. The rail stretched far into the distance. Only a few hundred feet from the place where they were seated, the Hardys could see both water tanks. The dilapidated, weather-beaten wooded one with some of the rungs missing from the ladder that led up its side, and the squat metal tank perched on spindly legs. Frank took a bite of his sandwich and chewed on it thoughtfully. The sight of the two water towers seemed to give him an idea, but at first it seemed to him too absurd for consideration. He was wondering whether or not he should mention it to his brother. Then he noticed that Joe, too, was gazing intently down the tracks at the tanks. Joe raised a cookie to his lips absently, attempted a bite, and missed the cookie altogether. Still, he continued gazing fixedly in the same direction. Finally, Joe turned and looked at his brother. Both knew they were thinking the identical thing. Two water towers, Frank said in a low but excited tone. An old one and a newer one, Joe murmured. And Jackley said he hid the stuff in the old tower. He was a railroad man. Why not? Joe shouted, springing to his feet. Why couldn't it have been this old water tower he meant? He used to work around here. After all, he didn't say the old Tower of Tower Mansion. He just said the old tower. Frank, I believe we stumbled on a terrific clue, Joe said jubilantly. It would be the natural thing for Jackie to come back to his former haunts after the robbery. Right, Frank agreed. And when he discovered that Chich Jalopy was gone, he probably thought the police were hot on his trail. So he decided to hide the loot someplace he knew, where no one else would suspect. The old water tower. This must be the place. Oh. of this episode may be reproduced without my personal permission. Railfan Roberts Reading Railroad is a production of Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Productions. And all podcast episodes are owned by Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Productions.